Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, an optimistic look at global conservation, presented by Nat Hab expedition leaders, Whelan and Olaf Malver. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for being here today. And just a reminder, today's webinar does not have a slideshow. Over to you, Court.
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate that. So yeah, you will see a slide on the screen just because we wanted to make sure people, when they were just joining the webinar, saw something on their screen and not just a couple blank video cams. So I'm gonna stop sharing that because this is gonna be a conversation about conservation today. So hopefully that makes it work. And Rob, if you see anything other than just the two of us, just let me know. But yeah, it's gonna be a conversation. So, you know, I do a lot of these webinars, and I have to say, and a lot of them are about conservation, a lot of them are about conservation travel, and about sustainability. I am our Chief Sustainability Officer. We'll get more to introductions here in just a second. But I might say this is one of the most important webinars I'll do in the world of conservation. It's one of the most important topics because from understanding sort of the psychology of optimism and why it's so critical and important in conservation, hopefully over the course of the next 45 minutes or so, it might flip the way you think about things and might inspire you to do even more in perpetuating the message of conservation, perpetuating the message of hope that we actually are doing better than we think in the world of conservation. So I just want to underline that we have a very, very important webinar today, but not least of which is because I'm joined by my dear friend and fellow expedition leader, fellow scientist, fellow everything, Olaf Malver, and I'll introduce him in a quick second. But as I mentioned, I'm our Chief Sustainability Officer. I'm an expedition leader. I head up a lot of our programs with World Wildlife Fund. I am a scientist. I wear a lot of different hats at Natural Habitat Adventures. Olaf, probably in his lifetime, has worn quite a bit more hats in the world of conservation travel and exploration science, and is now dabbling. That's an understatement. Now a very big expert in the world of viticulture and winemaking in Georgia. And not the Georgia you're thinking probably. This is not just outside of Atlanta. This is the Republic of Georgia. So he's coming in, burning the midnight oil, so to speak, from across the pond, across the Atlantic. So it's great to have you here, Olaf. I've known Olaf for a better part of a decade, but I've known of him for a lifetime. Not only does he have a PhD in biochemistry, and he makes fantastic traditional Georgian wine, led some amazing expeditions around the world. He knows 7 languages, probably 9 languages by now since the last we've talked. I don't know, what else have you learned recently, Olaf? But yeah, it's fantastic to be here. Olaf, thank you for joining us today in this talk.
Well, thanks a lot, Gord. I'm really excited about being here, and you and I are going to have a great conversation, and I hope that people will enjoy it.
Absolutely. Well, let's see. So I'm just going to bring up my notes here, but one of the things, you know, when we talk about optimism, we're going to go into some specific examples of where are the great conservation stories out there, where are the things that are happening in past, present, and future with look of like the hope beyond conservation and sustainability. But one of the first questions I want to pose to Olaf, I want to ask you, why is it worth being optimistic? Why do we have to sometimes force ourselves to be cheery and to look for the good in the world of conservation? I always like to start with why. Why is optimism a necessary part of the space, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's a key question to answer, because it's the attitude to things that you want to participate in that makes things successful. You know, we have this whole Glasgow COP26 right now, and the media up to this was very negative, and they talked a lot about cities being inundated with high water, about Malthusian solutions to the world, and lots of islands getting covered in the Pacific, and I feel that the common people mostly will just throw up their hands and say, whatever, what can I do? I mean, there's no hope here. Doomsday sayings, I think, really is a negative way of treating things. It paralyzes your creative mind, and it paralyzes us to survive. So the reason we want to talk about this is to change the dime a little bit, turn on a dime, and talk about some of the success stories that really are out there. That's why I think it's important to talk in this way.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, if I think you and I agree, Olaf, and I'm sure all those in the audience, that when we think of the term conservation, you know, what we're really trying to do is save the world. We're trying to make things better. And I think that we sort of become shackled and imperiled in our own way if we view just all the negative news out there as just adding on top of another, and there's no good news, and we're inundated by the bad news because, you know, frankly, bad news sells. And I don't want to get into that argument too much. I think a lot of people on this call will understand that. But the idea, and you know, as I was researching some questions and some ideas for this talk today, I mean, I was flooded with stories of positive conservation success stories, and we're going to share a number of those today. But I think if there's any big take-home message, which I'll probably repeat several times, is that if you look for it, it's absolutely out there. So, you know, part of the big challenge is retooling your brain to actually look for the positive stories rather than just having sort of reacting to things get pushed to us. There's so much being pushed to us today with our smartphones and email and internet, and unfortunately, we get pushed a lot of the negative stuff. One thing I'm going to tout a few times over the course of this presentation, it's flipped, but Factfulness, this book, it's a phenomenal book. It's one of the best books I've read in the past decade. And one of the quotes by Hans Rosling very early on is that things can be bad, but they can be getting better at the same time. And the quote here, I'll read it: "When things are getting better, we often don't hear about them. This gives us a systematically too negative impression of the world around us, which is very stressful." And I think that's a really key message. So it's about retooling your brain to look for the optimistic side, to look for the bright side of things. And, you know, there's a lot of it out there. So kind of getting into that segment of our talk, you know, the world is certainly not entirely full of conservation success stories or only full of conservation success stories. There are different parts of the planet that are doing things better or more progressively or having bigger victories out there. And Olaf, when we were talking about this discussion a few days ago, you had some amazing things that you brought to light of some things that you've personally worked on, some things from your personal conservation heroes. What are a couple of those on your mind today?
Well, before I go into some of the specific examples, I completely agree with you. We have to be optimistic. But what I hope comes out of this, so the end result of our talk here, would be that we have some cautious optimism, and that optimism is really based on facts. And it's the facts that you and I should give to people today, the facts for optimism, because there's too much talk about abstract things, particularly by politicians, but scientists like us, we tend to believe more in facts. So I'm here in Georgia, and I came here 20 years ago while I was working at Nat Hab and another my own adventure company, and I got somehow pushed into the Global Environmental Fund that's run by the World Bank to help restore or save all the old communist zapovedniks. So Soviet Union had all these protected parks that Stalin, one of the few good things that Stalin did was to save these areas for the public. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, we were sent out in all the stans and in Russia and in Armenia, Azerbaijan and Georgia to see if we could apply modern conservation and wildlife management and building parks, modern principles to how to build and conserve protected areas. So I started here in 2003 doing that, and as one of the first countries in the ex-Soviet Union bloc, we got through Parliament. We secured about 11%, about 6% of Georgia's area became by law a protected area. And these were all done by the IUCN classification system. And since then, just in Georgia, in 2017, we were 17%. This year is 11%. And in 2025, we already are planning big park areas. So we'll get up to 25% of the area. this is just like Costa Rica, very high. So like a quarter of the country is basically set aside to protect nature. This is very high. And in my research for this optimistic talk, I jumped into an article about my old hero and your hero too, Ed Wilson. The old ant professor he's now 93 years old, and he's still writing. And he wrote a book called Biophilia, which I will come back to later, which is basically that human beings, we have an inherent love for nature and a need for nature. And that is also a very optimistic thing. And he has now made a 30-30 foundation that's based on in 2030 to protect 30% of land and sea areas as protected areas in the world. And actually, in 2021, we are already at 26%. So we are only 4% from that very ambitious goal. So to me, it's a great joy to see poor countries like Georgia and globally also, we have reached such an enormous mass of protected areas. Because if we don't have protected areas, then biodiversity will disappear, and the carbon sink will be deteriorated. So this is great news on the conservation front. We are really increasing the number of protected areas.
Absolutely.
So you can also in a discussion afterwards when you have questions. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Jump in here and provide some context to this idea of habitat. I think both you and I agree that the number one conservation concern in the world today is habitat loss. There are some major concerns. Global warming, global climate change is up there. In a way, global climate change is really just representing a big habitat loss. So habitat loss, number one factor in the world for loss of biodiversity, kind of a callback to Ed Wilson, or E.O. Wilson, as he's sometimes known in the publishing circuit. He is the godfather of biodiversity conservation. And one of the stats that he'll throw out there, just again to provide context to the importance of habitat saving and the importance of biodiversity, is that the total annual ecosystem value that provides human services, meaning like what biodiversity does for water filtration and air filtration, nutrient recycling, food for animals, food for human consumption, all this amounts to about an equal value of $30 trillion a year that global biodiversity actually gives us. So sometimes people will say, well, can't we just engineer our way out of some of these crises? Yeah, if we can spend $30 trillion a year, I mean, first of all, no, we can't, but it just gives you an idea of the sum of money, the sum of human power and productivity that's needed just to keep biodiversity intact. So there's extraordinary value there. So I just wanted to interrupt you quickly to kind of provide that framework for why habitat conservation is the number one thing we have to do to therefore support biodiversity conservation and all the things that it does to make our world go round.
That's a very good point. I like that, and I have to tell you that a 93-year-old man still going strong wanted to spearhead 30% to be set aside as national parks and protected areas is very stimulating.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's also good to talk about protected areas in the context of natural habitat, because this is what we are all about. We take a lot of our clients to natural habitats to these protected areas for the same reason, to show them and make them ambassadors for conservation. So it's an intricate part of what we do at natural habitat. But let me glide on, if you don't mind, because I know you and I have a lot of facts to share. And I'm putting on a controversial, optimistic, and this is about the whales in the world. Okay, there's been a lot of in the press about Greenpeace hunting down whaling ships in the Antarctic. There's been a lot of criticism of some nations in the world that still have not signed up for the International Whale Moratorium, International Whale Conservation Moratorium. But I will say so much, when I went into the numbers, and the reason I'm a little bit close to this whole whaling conservation issue is that my own grandfather was a doctor in Grudviken in South Georgia, and he wrote stories about how the whole bay of Cumberland Bay was the size of, I think it was 40 square kilometers. That whole bay was filled with whale blood. This was in 1911. Anyhow, there was a big collapse of most whaling species in the world until the International Whaling Commission, I think it was in 1986, I have it, yes, 1986. They basically had all countries in the world sign up, no more whaling except four countries, which was Norway, Japan, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands. And when you look at the numbers, you saw the collapse on down to 1986, then it flattened out 87, and now a lot of whales are rebounding. Now, I'm not saying it's good that Norway, Japan, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands are doing whaling, but what I'm saying, it's good that the world got together and it did something. And now, for instance, the right whales are up 8% in the last 2 years. The humpbacks are up 10%, and whale watching in Iceland in 1998 was about 30,000 people. Now it's 500,000 people that go out whale watching. So now the whales are being used as a conservation message, one might say. So although there is a lot of criticism of what's going on with some nations whaling of about 1,000 whales a year, without this wonderful initiative, we would have no whales left today. So it was a disaster waiting to happen, and I'm so happy that the world got together like that, just said stop.
Absolutely. And what a great stat you said there about the historic numbers of whale watchers versus present day. And that's just such a powerful message when we talk about the context of conservation travel, aka ecotourism, is that what we're able to do is actually add value to those whales, because at some point there's a tipping point where even for those whaling countries, whale watching creates more value per whale because of people spending money in local economies, more value per whale than they otherwise could get from killing it, using it for meat or oil or what otherwise would have been done. So yeah, great conservation tool there. And another thing I wanted to jump in and say, a couple of great stats you had there about the increase year over year in humpbacks and right whales. I did see that as of now, humpbacks, which is probably one of the more famous whales of the world, they're very, very cosmopolitan, found in all oceans, is that they are at 93% of their pre-whaling numbers, which is pretty fantastic. We still got that 7% to go to get it exactly what it was before a relatively large collapse. But again, talking about global optimism, 93%, that's an A in my book. We're doing very, very well there. We're looking at about 150,000 humpback whales today in these oceans. And anyone that's been out to see humpback whales, whether it's been in Hawaii or Alaska or even off the coast of Mexico, you'll notice that they're doing fairly well out there. So yeah, again, good reason for hope.
Right. And then one thing I'm really, really happy about that has particularly come up the last, and it's not because she's Swedish, but the Greta Thunberg effect. Some people don't like her, but because she might be a little bit too much blah, blah, blah. But I like her because she's driving a lot of attention among other young people. And there was a very, very recent study where the UN interviewed 10,000 young people between 14 and 18 years old. And 89% of them, this was young people from all over the world, 89% of them thought that they need more information about the environmental challenges, showing that the young people are not only engaged, they're very curious. They are looking for this environmental understanding and an opportunity. And another 89% really think that the young people that they can make a difference. So there's a huge self-confidence in that group of people, which is wonderful. So it's really a very positive force stepping forward. And 73% of them, they know a lot about what's happening. They follow the Glasgow summit. They are demonstrating there, but the amount of awareness and alertness about the young among the young people is super high. So I think that's a fantastic positive tool for us all to go forward in a positive way. I mean, we are doing this for our children and their children, so I'm glad that they are on the bandwagon themselves.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with what Greta's been able to do. It's pretty phenomenal. You can say what you want, positive or negative, but you know what she's been able to do is create a movement. She's perpetuated a conservation culture. One of the most, in my opinion, most important things we can do in our society is create that culture, continue the conversation about conservation, about climate change, what have you. So it's pretty phenomenal. You know, I think you know, one of the most important things to realize when we're thinking about the long game of conservation, because we're here, you know, for the overall long-term health of the world, is that it's easy to hear the day-to-day stories, the week-to-week stories, and think that, you know, we need to solve the problem tomorrow, or we need to solve the problem in a week from now. And yes, that'd be fantastic. I couldn't agree more that that would be the best thing possible. But we also have to look back and think a little bit that we are thinking a bit on a generation scale. And so, you know, it's going to be very difficult to solve all the world's problems in a week or a month or even a year. But it gives me great hope when we see people, the young people, the stats you just mentioned, Olaf, as well as the things that Greta's talking about and all other youth advocates, is that when you think of a human generation time, which is averaged at about 25 years, a single generation, within the next 2 generations, we will have more people at that age growing up being the leaders in conservation than ever before. I think even today, one of the most inspiring facts that cannot be argued against is the fact that we have more people on our planet today that care vehemently about conservation than ever before. You might say, well, the proportion is the same, or percentage is the same, or maybe it's not changing that much. But as far as per capita, or as far as numbers of people on the planet with ideas, with inspiration that are becoming leaders, we have more on the planet right now today than ever before at any point in history. And it only takes 1 or 5 or 10 phenomenal leaders to create those movements and to do great things. So I fully agree with you, Olaf, on that youth movement as being a really positive thing for now and for the future and the next generations.
Right. And then, you know, the more obvious thing for you and I, who are in the ecotourism world, who's in the tourism world, the nature tourism world, is that, and these are numbers that I have to update every month for the Georgian government, is that one of the strongest segments in tourism, not one of the strongest segments, because cruise ships are still the most in dollars biggest tourism segment of the industry, but the fastest growing segment is basically nature and ecotourism. And it's very interesting that there was a very recent study done where the growth of tourism of ecotourism was measured in different countries, and out of 20 countries, 18 of them were growing quickly. Only 2 countries, Japan and the United States, were a little bit slow, and that might have to do with more people from Japan and the United States traveling outside and visiting nature areas. But there was also another interesting number in that study, which was that the fastest growth are in the countries that are the poorest. So it's really good because the poor countries don't have much funds to help conservation, to support conservation. So in those countries, tourism has a much bigger economical impact. So that's a fantastic negative correlation between GDP and dollars generated by ecotourism in these countries. So ecotourism is fantastic for economical reasons and for conservation reasons. And you know, that's another seminar to talk about how these ecotourism that we create are basically ambassadors to come back and talk about beautiful Galapagos to their children or to their families and friends. So we generate very important positive ambassadors to spread the environmental conservation message in that way.
Fully agree. And you mentioned Galapagos, so I'll share a random new factoid here. Just a couple of days ago, the president of Ecuador, which owns Galapagos Islands, was at the Glasgow conferences, and made a huge announcement that he was going to add an additional 60,000 square kilometers to the marine protected area of Galapagos Islands. This is brand new. This is hot off the press. You can Google it, and there's some phenomenal articles out there. But basically what they have done is they've expanded the marine protected area to a boundary that actually abuts with Costa Rica's marine protected area. And if you didn't know, Costa Rica actually has a substantial marine protected area. It's Isla Cocos, which is a phenomenal little couple of islands way off the coast of Costa Rica. Interestingly, where a lot of Jurassic Park was filmed. Again, great thing to research and look it up. Yeah, Isla Cocos. And so it's a great diving area. There's no real land-based operations, but there's a massive marine protected area because it's a very large stronghold for sharks and a lot of other marine critters. But basically what this new Galapagos edition has done is expand their marine protected area to abut next to another marine protected area, create a corridor between those two marine protected areas, and the sum of the parts is greater, or the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, because you're actually creating this single large protected area with ample corridors. So that's brand new, hot off the press, very, very inspiring.
Yeah, that leads me to another thing, Court, when you talk about these corridors, that wildlife conservation managers, both in the sea, on the sea, and in the on land, have been much better in designing national parks to include corridors and have more dendritic systems that follows not only migratory routes, but also how people move and how rivers flow and so forth. So the knowledge of how to make these very complex ecosystems have really increased a lot. We use a lot of that knowledge in Georgia today, and in fact, our national park system have been presented at the IUCN conferences as a model system for how complex we have to restore these systems into.
Absolutely. And just to kind of provide some context there, there's been a very long debate in the world of ecology. It's called the Slos Debate, S-L-O-S-S, single large or several small, when it comes to designing and designated protected areas. And it's long been debated as to, if you have a magic wand and you go to a country and you get the chance to designate a national park, a national park system, do you choose one large area or several small that are connected by corridors? And the great thing is, when we say that technology will help us in the fight for conservation, a lot of people think, oh, well, it's because we can design electric cars and we can do carbon capture technology and we can make wind farms. That's all well and good. Those are great uses of technology, but a lot of the technology happens in the computer laboratory to create these models and actually, through mathematics, understand that, okay, if you have this surface area of one park here versus a chance for these parks here, through mathematical models and computer systems, we can actually definitively say, well, based on the species here, the birds here, the waterways, the mountains, the different life zones, it's actually better in this patch of Costa Rica, or in this cloud forest of Ecuador, or in the Himalayas of Nepal. It's better to designate one large or several small, or however you want to do it. There's differences there, or to make sure that these several small patches have the proper connectivity. It's actually best to build a corridor between reserve A and B versus C and D. So it's really exciting to see what some of that mathematic modeling can do in the world of conservation.
Yeah, and one of the biggest problems about creating these big parks with a big fence around it, it excludes many of the local indigenous people that used to live in there. So this whole balance between people having a livelihood and at the same time have protection, it has become much more sophisticated, and I think it's a fantastic progress in wildlife management that's happening right now.
Yep, couldn't agree more. Well, before we move on to a couple more questions that I have for you all, I jotted some of these notes down that I think are quite interesting and inspirational. One is from a country that is one of my most beloved. It's Madagascar, and I know you as well, Olaf, love Madagascar. If those in the audience haven't had a chance to get there, it's a true wonder of the world. It's the 8th continent. It's a biological treasure chest. We often look at Madagascar as I hesitate to say this, but a poor example of conservation, because so little natural area remains. Now, when we're in those natural areas, it seems like the whole country is teeming with lemurs and pythons and chameleons, because it seems like that. These reserves are relatively large, but compared to the size of the island, very little remains. However, a conservation tidbit here that's actually quite inspirational is that since 2003, This is now going on 20 years. Madagascar has tripled the land coverage area of their reserve system, tripled, so 300% larger. And this kind of speaks to a different tangent that we may or may not go down here, depending on what your reaction to it is, Olaf. But sometimes we think that conservation issues, especially because of how the news is delivered to us, it's something that just happened. It happened in the last 20 years or last 40 years, or in some cases last couple hundred years. There are actually places in the world where the damage, frankly, has been done over the last couple millennia. Madagascar is an example where a lot of the deforestation, a lot of the invasive species, or a lot of the issues actually happened, about 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. Some of the animals that have gone extinct actually happened when ancient seafaring traders went up and down north and south on the eastern coast of Africa, settling in Madagascar, and sort of decimated the local wildlife there. Not a good thing, but nevertheless, it provides context that not all ecological problems are things that the real recent modern man has done. We, in fact, are making up for losses that happened many, not even centuries, but thousands of years ago.
That's right. I mean, one good book to start with is Jared Diamond's Collapse, where he has a very good boilerplate model for why our societies, maybe the planet, why is it collapsing, and what to do about it. And he mentions Iceland. Iceland was a forest. Scotland was a forest. Micronesia, Melanesia, Fiji. These were covered with forest before the Melanesian and Polynesian migrations. So this is not something new, but there are ways of understanding why it happened, and we can positively use that going forward.
Yeah, absolutely required reading for anyone that's interested in this. Jared Diamond is the author. The book is Collapse. It's phenomenal. It was written, what would you say, Olaf, maybe 10, 15 years ago, but it has, about a dozen or 15 very deep case studies into how governments responded to ecological stress, how ancient civilizations responded to ecological stress. And gosh, if every world leader could read and understand that book, we'd be in a lot better place. So if you guys read it and pass it on to them, that'd be fantastic. But it's a very, very informative, very helpful.
And it's easy to read. It's very easy to read also.
Yeah, and it's broken down into chapters of case studies of Iceland versus Greenland, Haiti versus Dominican Republic, and the list goes on. It's absolutely amazing. Yeah. So I want to list off a couple other interesting success stories, some recent, some actually back several decades ago. Many of those in the audience will know of the California condor. It's an emblem of conservation, an emblem of ecological distress, of course. A bit of a conservation success story there. I actually was just over in Zion National Park not too long ago and got to see some soaring in the air. It was very inspiring. But this is a species that was at almost extinction. I mean, really just a couple of handfuls left in the wild in 1987. Now roughly 500 wild Californian condors are flying and nesting today. And just a few years ago, the 1,000th chick was hatched of the California Condor Rescue Program. Very, very inspiring there. Something that goes back a little bit before that, but another one of the larger birds in North America, the bald eagle. In 1963, only 480 pairs remained. Now today, with all sorts of action and regulation and information and inspiration, we'll just kind of do some alliteration there. Roughly 150,000 bald eagles exist today. A couple others more recent. Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. Now, again, I should have said this more vehemently at the beginning. I do not want to sugarcoat the continued ongoing problems of the world. This is not me putting blinders on and say it's all rosy and everything's perfect. But nevertheless, when you see these things, it's important to understand that things can be bad, but be getting better at the same time. It's important to do some looking and to continue that inspiration so that you can be part of the fight and not just be down in despair. Another more recent example, the mountain gorillas of East Africa, fantastic example. These guys have been on the brink of very low numbers and near extinction, or at least local extirpation. 480 remained in 2010. That number has grown to over 1,000 today, so almost doubled in the last 10 years. That's very good. And ecotourism, conservation travel is very much at the heart of that. We see very, very similar numbers from giant pandas in China as well. Giant pandas have actually recently been taken off the endangered species list because those numbers have rebounded to over 1,800 in the wild and another 400 or 500 in captivity that actually lend themselves to pretty decent breeding stock. And lots of things have been researched to figure out, essentially how to reintroduce if it came down to it. So a lot of good things going on there. Of course, we like to keep track of all the success stories, and we want to see these things continue to happen. But again, it's inspirational to see that things are indeed getting better in present day time. So
good stories, good examples.
Yeah, certainly. And then I'll list a very final one here, because this is actually an ongoing, well, they're all ongoing projects, but one that's supposed to kind of come to its terminus here soon is known as the TX2 project, TX2, from World Wildlife Fund and a number of other organizations. This was something set out a number of years ago to double the number of wild tigers by the year 2022. So that's coming up soon. They're very close to the mark. They're not quite there yet, but the fact that they're able to even get close to that mark with an ambitious goal of wild tigers, the world's largest cat, needing some of the largest ranges, some of the largest food items, the biggest habitat space. The fact that they're at 33% increase as of today, or at least recently, is also good news. Tigers, world's largest cat, is getting very close to that TX2 promise, which is really, really fantastic. So I want to get back to the Q&A part. Olaf, I've got a few questions for you as we sort of near the end of our presentation. One, I kind of want to get your take. How have you viewed conservation attitudes to have shifted over the last, say, 30 years?
So I was involved very early on with World Wildlife Fund, and have of course been involved through natural habitat also. And I think they have shifted the way they communicate the conservation message. They started very much being scientific. So these were numbers, and the organizations were run by scientists. And I think the message went a little bit over people's head, and they realized that they needed some more funding. So they started another message, and the next message was the scaring tactics that we are talking about is not so productive. So for years they talked about how we are going to go to hell if we don't do something about it. And then finally there was a period where they said, well, how can we benefit from conservation? How can Homo sapiens benefit? And there were all kinds of work going on with tagua nuts and butterfly farming and economical incentives to conserve things. And finally, that didn't work so well either. And finally, they are coming to a place where they are more positive, and they are more emotional. They speak to our positive emotions, and I like that. And I particularly really like Conservation International. I think it's Conservation International, maybe you could correct me, where they have this message saying that the nature doesn't need us, we need nature. Okay, so it's like turning it around. It's not so anthropocentric anymore. It's positive, but that message is, I really like that. I really like that they have changed and realized that you need to touch the positive nerve and get us a little bit out of the equation and rather look at our relationship with nature. So that's the major change I have seen. Because it's really about our relationship. How do we love nature? How does nature accept us? This is what it's all about. And we are unfortunately we have become very disjunct from nature. I like to say, I worked a lot with Inuit people in Greenland over the years, over 30, 40 years, and they're really nature people. So they have to react to nature on nature terms because it's so harsh. Otherwise they will die. And how do they do that? Well, they are practical, they are alert, and they are very, very funny. Okay, and they have survived and used those human qualifications. So what we need to do is look at things with facts and practicalities. We need to be alert about it, knowledgeable, move forward, and we need to look at it in a positive, maybe not funny way, but in an optimistic way. So, and they survived under the harshest conditions. So we might need to have those kind of human qualifications going forward. And maybe that's the next step, in the NGOs' messages to take those kind of human elements into the equation.
That's fantastic. That leads me into my next question, or even partially answers it. I was going to ask, what do you think the next 30 years holds in terms of nature and conservation communication, conservation priorities? Where do we put our money? Where do we put our communication talents? How do we keep our eye on the prize? What do the next 30 years hold, in your opinion? Or where should
we have to get the young? Yeah, there's no doubt about it. It leads into what I said before. We have to get the young people alerted. We have to get them involved in the conservation process. And already there's 500,000 grant recipient of young people between 14 and 18 years old that have received grants from the UN in environmentally positive projects. So that's going forward. We need to do more. They need to be involved from the start. And also, we need to involve not only the wealthy and those who have a lot of resources. We need also to get the message down to those people who might not know so much right now and who needs that little positive, optimistic push. So conservation cannot be an upper class problem. It has to be an all class problem.
Excellent. So I want to make sure we save ample time for questions, but I do have one more question for you before we turn it over back to Rob and some Q&A from the audience. So if you haven't yet submitted questions, please go ahead and do so in the chat feature. But so Olaf, optimism takes work. It's not always obvious. In fact, sometimes it feels like the world, or at least those that we come into contact with, are kind of pushing us the other way. It's like we have to be resilient and snap back with optimism. How do you personally deal with that? How do you personally find yourself to be optimistic? What tips to the audience could you share? How do you remain hopeful?
I do not watch any spam news on my little PDF. First of all,
Number one, yeah, that's the first one.
But the most important thing, and say that to your children and to your parents, go into nature, feel nature. The moment you go out there and you sit on a stone in the forest, unfortunately, we're spending, and of course it's pandemic times, we're spending less and less time in nature. When you get out there and you just sit there by the lake half an hour, you will feel some love. So get out there.
I love it. So what I'm reading from that is turn off your screen sometime and don't get those pushes of negative news, but maybe more importantly, find your inspiration. I would imagine everybody on this talk today finds inspiration in nature. And I have to say, during the last year and a half, with very, very different type of travel constraints and very different types of lives, just getting out, like you said, and sitting by the pond, sitting by the lake, taking a stroll just outside. I find myself just going outside and deeply breathing and finding nature flowing into me. So finding your inspiration, I would say my answer to that question would probably, my number one way is well, you've got to be hopeful. There's no point in being otherwise, because that's a very, very unfun way to live a life. But, in terms of, how to do it, look for it. And the hours and days I spent looking up stuff for this presentation, like I was mentioning at the beginning of the talk, I was inundated with amazing facts, with amazing stories out there. As long as you look for it, it's there. For whatever reason, it doesn't get pushed to us quite as much in today's society. I think that there are many reasons why, but if you go out and look for it, it is there. And then again, before I turn it over to questions, I want to once again plug this, because I think that this might be, along with Collapse, Olaf's recommendation of Collapse, this fact from this book by Hans Rosling is one of the more important books I think out there today. I'm just going to read a couple quotes or reviews. The first one, Bill Gates, you may know him, says, one of the most important books I've ever read, an indispensable guide to thinking clearly about the world. Another guy, former President Barack Obama, you may know him as well, a hopeful book about the potential for human progress when we work off of facts rather than our inherent biases. And what it does, it actually teaches us to identify those biases. And there's some really, really amazing things in here that gets you to realize, the subtitle is 10 Reasons We're Wrong About the World and Why Things Are Better Than You Think. And again, I do not want to sugarcoat it. We have our work cut out for us. The world needs to be a better place tomorrow than it is today. But I think one of the best tools and techniques to get there is by having an optimistic outlook. And hopefully the information in this presentation and some of the tools we talked about will get us all there speedily. So I'll kind of wrap it up there and hand it over to questions from the audience.
Thank you, Court, and thank you, Olaf. Now, before we start the question and answer session, I'd like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. All right, we do have a few questions, so let's get started. So now the new Galapagos Ocean Protection Area that they just announced, is that something that could link up with ours, or is there any movement to link all such areas globally?
I'll start with that one. Great question. Short answer, yeah. I want to save all the oceans, you know, I mean, absolutely. Now, in the world of conservation, there are a couple ways to look at it. One is we are in a bit of a triage situation. We need to save areas that have extraordinarily or disproportionately high activity, high biodiversity, high productivity, basically. And so I think it's very important that we identify those zones that are most important and save those first. And if you go on, again, Google is a great resource for this, and look up the 25 of the world's biodiversity hotspots or priority spots, you'll notice that there are certain zones that get, again, disproportionate attention in the world of conservation. Those will not necessarily all link up in corridors directly. Now, when we're talking about oceans, technically everywhere in the ocean is a corridor in some way, shape, or form, because there is more connectivity than on land, you know. But nevertheless, yeah, I don't know of any direct subsequent marine areas other than expanding those that currently exist. Like, I don't think there's one, say, in California that's going to make its way down there in the next couple of years and link up. But I will say it's doable, it's possible. We would like that to happen, but I think that it's going to be more about saving the priority areas as fast as possible. But Olaf.
Yeah, well, I think that one of the impetuses for creating this new wildlife corridor in the ocean around Galapagos has been this amazing, disappointing shark hunting by the Chinese. They have decimated the shark populations in those waters, and the sharks are very, very important animals in that whole ecosystem. So that's very good news. But also, just like we talked about national parks on land, we also have to give a little bit room for human activities. And I know that there are very important sea lanes going into Los Angeles, and that area here, it has to be kept open for a lot of traffic. So we have to find this balance between conservation and human economical activity. So I don't think we can block from equator all the way up to Alaska in one big conservation zone.
But that is the spirit. That is the mentality.
No, that is the spirit, but you have to be cautiously optimistic based on facts and taking everything into consideration. That's my message, okay?
True.
Great, thank you. Now, does Ecuador have a navy to enforce their newly expanded marine conservation?
Small. Very small.
Very small. And so how does that get enforced?
It is enforced by Ecuadorian Navy. Yeah, it certainly is. My guess is that there's probably going to be some additional regulatory bodies involved. But I mean, that's the issue, is that we never get to completion. You know, you can set this aside and that's one step better, but then the next step is getting the Navy to enforce it. The next step is getting other NGOs to get out there and enforce it. Yeah, ultimately, you know, the big win here is that it's indeed designated that, and it's indeed illegal to encroach on those areas. But yeah, ultimately, you know, when push comes to shove, armed forces definitely have the end game in play. But yeah, I would like to see all that be enforced more vehemently, of course.
So, you know, one thing that a guest of ours found fascinating, and I did too, is I never really thought about the impact of early humans on wildlife and nature. How do Indigenous people remain in their areas today and still become stewards of their area and live sustainably?
Well, I can talk about the Arctic a lot, and also the Pacific. They have an innate respect for nature, so they never overhunt. Like the Inuits know that that they can only take so much out of the ocean before it gets. They're so much in tune with nature that they don't tip the balance, because they live from nature.
Yeah, exactly. And I think with local indigenous populations, they have usually been a little bit more rudimentary, a little bit more hunter-gatherer type style, and their populations have just not really increased to the point where they're expanding as quickly as the quote-unquote modern man.
That's right.
Yeah. So, but today they are some of the best stakeholders out there, and a lot of it really does come down to this idea of ecotourism and conservation travel. It's huge because you have to get local buy-in. So much of the reason we do ecotourism and conservation is not just to save the elephant or the tiger or the panda, but it's to empower local folks to actually earn more money by protecting the forest, by keeping the forest safe than the other way around. A great example is in Mexico, talking about the monarch butterfly migration. These communities, or ejidos as they're called locally, are tens of thousands of people that are historically farmers. They're agrarian. They would dabble in mining, and they found that over the course of time that there's actually a lot more financial incentive to be had by conserving patches of forest with monarch butterflies. Now, does every one of those 20, 30, 40,000 people love butterflies as much as I do, or Olaf does, or natural habitat and guests? Probably not, but they are economic tools. They are more profitable to keep butterflies flying and beautiful and alive than if we were to cut down those forests for corn, for beans, for agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. So it actually turns out to be the best way to put food on the table. And so much of the work we do in just raw conservation, but also in conservation travel, is working with local people, because they are the stakeholders, they are the protectors of the forest.
Yeah, in that same study by the UN of who was mostly aware of conservation issues, indigenous people are much higher than anybody else.
So in an area
that's good. Yeah.
In an area like Madagascar, where they're experiencing drought and famine, how do the people balance the protected areas against the need to feed themselves?
That's the $1 million question, and this is why it's very devastating right now with COVID and the lack of travel to Madagascar, is because it is their largest foreign exchange earner. It's a sizable part of their GDP is ecotourism. It's been growing meteorically, and that's been very, very good for conservation. And so this is not just a Madagascar problem, but it's really an all-world problem, is that if they depend on ecotourism or conservation travel, and then that's taken away, whether it's because the government no longer protects the forest and the forests degrade, or because of big world situations, they sometimes are forced to go into the forest and cut down trees or put snares, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where, in this very, I say temporary time period, this is finite. This is a matter of years. This is not decades. This is not centuries that we have this travel restriction. There are a lot of NGOs stepping up. I know World Wildlife Fund is stepping up. I know CI is stepping up. I know Doctors Without Borders is stepping up. Natural Habitat is stepping up. We've donated a lot of money via our community relief fund to Madagascar specifically, because they're one of the hardest hit by COVID and the lack of tourism. But that's the biggest issue, is that, you always worry about this. This was a thing back in Africa for many decades, when nations like Zaire turned over, when Uganda had its difficulties, is that people would not be able to be employed by the government, by local services, not just tourism, but in general. And one of the first places they may go is go hunting for bushmeat. And so I think a good way to protect against that for any sort of temporary interruption, as we'll certainly have at some point in the future, is to create so much value for that lemur, create so much value for that chameleon, is that even in times of difficulty, it's still taboo, it's still highly frowned upon, and very obviously counterproductive for people to just have a lapse and go into the forest and hunt for bushmeat. It's still not the way to do it. But fortunately, there are a lot of NGOs stepping up in this time to do all they can do to help. But my heart does go out to Madagascar.
Yeah. So I mean, I would end my comment. I think we are at the end of the time now. But I think again, it's time to be cautiously optimistic, and I ask you all to turn on the optimist button, but it has to be based on facts. So maybe it helps a little bit every time you have a question or what's going on. Do some research by yourself, and really, when you then have a discussion around the dinner table, come up with the facts, and you'll be surprised how many good things are actually happening.
Now, before we go, you did mention a couple of books. One was Factfulness by Hans Rowling and Collapse by Jared Diamond. But Olaf, you mentioned another book right at the beginning. Could you let us know what the name of that book was and who wrote it? We have so many questions about these books people really want to read.
I don't remember that one. Do you remember that, Gert? I thought it was Collapse. I kind of took that and ran with it and gave a little bit more context, but I think it was Collapse at the very beginning. Yeah, talking about the case studies. Yeah, certainly. Now, if you want another book from Jared Diamond, his probably most famous is Guns, Germs, and Steel. That is a bit less about conservation, but I'll tell you, it's one of the most impressive books to give you an idea of essentially how the world works. Not in modern times. It doesn't tell you about where shipping lanes are, in the Bering Sea, but it tells you kind of like how did things really get to be where they are today. He's a great author, and I think he's actually got a newer book as well. Oh, maybe were you talking about E.O. Wilson? Maybe Ed Wilson? Yeah. So you did mention his book on the ants. He's a famous entomologist, so obviously has a special place in my heart. I've met him and traveled with him several times. But I will put another book out there called The Future of Life by Ed Wilson. It's a slightly older book. It was written in 2001, but a lot of the numbers are still very current. So yeah, Future of Life is a great one by E.O. Wilson or Ed Wilson.
Oh yeah, no, I know. Biophilia by E.O. Wilson. Biophilia by E.O. Wilson. Yeah. Very good book.
Biophilia, biophilia.
It talks about the love we have for nature, which should drive all this.
Yeah, Ed Wilson is quite a guy, not just a top scientist, a Harvard professor, has his own foundation, but I think he's authored something like 30 big, like powerful books, not just publications. He's got hundreds of those scientific publications, but like real deal books. He's an amazing person. You should get to know him, even if it's just virtually over the internet in researching what he's done throughout the course of a very, very impressive lifetime.
And another author to follow is Stephen Jay Gould. He's not with us anymore, but he has some very nice short stories about conservation and also Darwinism. So it puts a little bit more of an animal perspective to who we are, where we come from, and maybe where we are going.
Excellent.
Wonderful. Gentlemen, thank you for the recommendations. This was a great talk, and as one of our guests said, it was inspiring, getting rid of all this talk of gloom and doom and being positive. One last thing though, Court. One of our guests wants you to grab that ukulele and sing us a happy song. Can you do it?
Oh man. Well, I've got a guitar right here. You just didn't see this one. Conservation? No.
Well,
next time I'll have to write something.
Thanks for that. I'm afraid that's the last question we'll have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you, gentlemen, if you have any closing comments for us today.
Well, I want to thank you sincerely for joining. It was a little bit of a different talk, but it's one that's been a long time coming, and I think it's something that is so integral in the fight for conservation. The optimistic stories we shared today and the feelings we shared does not mean we do not have our work cut out for us. We have to work harder than ever, but I think part of the reason or part of the way we can work harder than ever is getting the world to realize that it can indeed improve, it can indeed be saved. So it's a coupled action. You've got to be optimistic and get ready to do the work.
I completely concur, and I totally enjoy working with you, Court. And if anybody has any more questions, send them to Court, and then we'll try to answer them by email. Okay.
Olaf, Court, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.